I had just finished wiping the kitchen counters, the scent of lemon cleaner still clinging to my hands, when I heard the soft laughter from the living room. At first I thought it was one of the neighbors' kids. They often came over to drop off their little chaos. But then I recognized the rhythm, the warmth. It was him, my husband, and it wasn't a neighbor kid. I froze just inside the doorway. My husband was wrapped in an embrace that made my stomach twist and my heart slam against my ribs. She was young, maybe 25, with that effortless beauty you can't help but notice. Her head rested on his shoulder, his hand cradling the back of her head like he'd done that 1,000 times. My mouth went dry, and the sound of my own heartbeat became deafening. I wanted to yell, to storm in, demand answers, but something inside me shifted. My hands unclenched. My legs felt heavy, almost rooted to the spot, but I forced myself to step forward, slower than I thought possible. Every step felt like walking through molasses, and then I smiled. Not the trembling, desperate kind. It was calm, measured, a smile that said, "I see you. I understand more than you think." I knew I had to act, not out of anger, but with a weight that would make them both pause. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just stood there letting the silence stretch, letting them feel it. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. They finally noticed me when the clock struck a deliberate, heavy second. My husband stiffened first, his arms slowly retreating, eyes wide with panic. The young woman jerked back too, like a deer caught in headlights. Neither of them spoke. I let them sit in that tension for a long beat, long enough for the truth to settle like dust in the air. "I see you," I said softly, my voice even, almost serene. "I see everything." My husband opened his mouth, then closed it again. He tried to step forward, to grab my hand, to explain, but I held up my hand, stopping him without raising my voice. "Don't! Just don't!" Her eyes flicked to me, searching for some expression of welcome or leniency. I gave her none, just a calm, icy stare. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't about shouting or blaming. It was about consequences. I could feel the room tighten around us, the air thick with what wasn't said, with every unspoken word. Then I turned, deliberately slow, and walked out of the living room, leaving them both frozen in the aftermath of my quiet authority. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the sound of my own breathing fill the silence. I didn't cry. Not yet. Not when I needed to think, to plan, to prepare for the next move that would make them both remember who they were dealing with. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. Not rage, not hurt, not betrayal. Clarity. And with it came a cold, thrilling sense of strategy. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I never do. I got dressed deliberately, picking the outfit I knew he liked most on me. Not to tempt, not to seduce, but to remind him who he had, who he was losing if he didn't act. I left the bedroom in silence, each step measured, each breath steady. My heart was racing, but not with panic. It was anticipation, like the calm before a storm hits. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of wine and sat at the island, swirling it slowly. He appeared at the doorway, trying to force a smile, trying to soften the tension. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was hesitant, too casual, like he thought that could erase what I'd just witnessed. "No," I said, cutting him off. My eyes didn't leave his. "You're going to listen. You're going to watch me handle this my way." Her presence in the living room was a weight I could feel, even though I didn't look at her. The younger woman shifted nervously, glancing between us like she was waiting for a cue. I let her stew. I let them both stew. My silence became louder than any words I could throw. Finally, he sat across from me, defeated before he even spoke. It's complicated," he stammered. "I didn't mean for complicated," I repeated, voice low but sharp, like a knife sliding through tension. "You think this is complicated? You think betrayal has degrees? There's only one degree, and you've crossed it." I took a sip of wine, savoring the taste, the cool burn on my throat giving me focus. He flinched at my calmness. That's when I knew they underestimated me. All this time, I'd been quiet, holding myself together, letting life happen to me, but not anymore. Not now. I stood up, letting my chair scrape the floor loudly. You're going to fix this, not by groveling, not by begging, by choosing right now who you really are, because I see everything, and everyone else will too if you don't get it straight. He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand. And you, I said, turning to her finally, you need to decide if this is worth being part of a lie, because lies have a way of catching fire, and I'm not the one who's going to burn first. The younger woman swallowed hard. I could see the regret flickering in her eyes, the realization that she had stepped into a storm bigger than herself. I didn't pity her. I didn't have to. The truth had its own weight, and she was feeling it now. I left the room again, deliberately. This time I went outside to the backyard, letting the autumn air hit my face. The chill made me feel alive, sharp, alert. I watched them through the glass doors, frozen like statues, and I smiled again. Not sweetly, not kindly, but with the satisfaction of someone who had just regained her power. This was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared. I wasn't weak. I was ready, and I knew exactly how to make sure everyone remembered who I was and who I wasn't. By the next morning, I had already mapped out exactly how I was going to handle this. I didn't want drama, screaming, or public embarrassment, at least not yet. I wanted precision, impact, a move so clean, so sharp, that everyone involved would feel the weight of their choices without me lifting a finger unnecessarily. I made breakfast quietly, the smells of coffee and sizzling eggs filling the kitchen, a normalcy that made my husband's earlier actions feel all the more absurd. When he walked in, I didn't rush to confront him. I let him stew in his guilt. He tried to apologize, fumbling over words that no longer had power. I didn't mean anything, he said, voice low, eyes darting everywhere except mine. I poured my coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the sound of liquid hitting the mug stretch into an uncomfortable silence. You didn't mean anything, I repeated, letting the phrase hang between us like smoke. And yet here we are. I see everything, I always have. He flinched at the firmness in my voice. He'd spent years assuming my calmness meant passivity, that I would tolerate small betrayals, compromises, and slights without consequence. He was wrong, dead wrong. Then I did something that made him freeze completely. I called my sister, not to yell, not to gossip, but to make sure someone else knew the truth before the younger woman could twist it, or before he could try to cover it up. The phone rang once, twice, and my sister answered, her voice warm and curious. Hey, what's up? I need you over, I said calmly, without giving him a chance to interject. And bring your camera. He stared at me, confusion and fear dancing across his face. Camera? Why, because, I interrupted, walking past him with purposeful steps. We're going to make something very clear. Not for you, not for her, for me, and for anyone else who might think crossing me doesn't have consequences. By the time my sister arrived, the younger woman had already left, slipping out the back door in a hasty, regretful silence. I watched from the window, my heart steady, my mind sharp. She had made her choice. The lesson would sting, but it was hers to carry. Inside, my sister raised an eyebrow at the tension thick in the room. I just smiled faintly. It's time, I said, and we moved through the next steps like clockwork. Emails, messages, subtle reminders to the right people, all strategically timed. I watched my husband squirm, realizing that his secret wasn't a secret anymore, that his actions, his betrayal, had consequences that couldn't be smoothed over with excuses or empty promises. By evening, the weight of the day had shifted. He was subdued, careful with every word, every movement. And me? I sat in the living room, wine in hand, knowing I had regained control, not just over the situation, but over myself, over the narrative. There was still work to be done. There would be conversations, reckonings, decisions, but I was no longer reacting. I was acting, and acting, I realized, was power in its purest form. By the fifth day, the tension had become almost unbearable, though I carried myself as if nothing had changed. I walked into the office, the smell of coffee and paper greeting me, and I noticed the small shifts in the air, glances held a beat too long, hushed whispers fading when I approached. Word traveled fast. The quiet power I exuded wasn't just about what I knew, it was about how I moved, how I let people feel the consequences of actions without a single raised voice. At home, the atmosphere had changed too. My husband tiptoed around me, every step careful, every word measured. I could see the fear behind his eyes. Not panic, not desperation, but recognition that the game had shifted and I held all the pieces. I didn't gloat, didn't make threats. I let him watch me live, thrive, and reclaim my space while he lingered on what he had lost. Then came the unexpected twist. The younger woman reached out, not for reconciliation, not for sympathy, but to apologize. I didn't answer immediately. I watched her message sit in my inbox for hours. When I finally opened it, I didn't scold, I didn't shame. I simply acknowledged it, letting her understand that awareness was the first step toward real change. That was her lesson, not mine to teach with anger. But the real turning point came when my husband's colleagues began noticing the shift. Subtle comments, polite smiles that carried a knowing edge, invitations I hadn't received in months suddenly arriving in my mailbox. People were recognizing me again, not the woman who stayed silent, who tolerated small betrayals, but the woman who had risen, unshaken, unbroken, and unafraid. One evening, he tried to discuss us, cautiously, timidly, like a man approaching a wild animal. I let him talk, listening, nodding, not interrupting, my posture calm and unyielding. And then I spoke, not with rage, not with tears, but with precision. "This is the consequence of your choices," I said. "I will not chase someone who cannot see my value. I will not grovel for respect that is not earned. You have your decisions, I have mine, and mine lead to freedom, clarity, and peace." He stared at me, words lost somewhere between realization and regret. I didn't soften, I didn't flinch. I just let him sit in the room with the truth, that I was no longer the woman who would endure in silence, the woman who would quietly absorb betrayal. That night, I walked through the house, touching the walls, inhaling the air of a home that now felt truly mine again. It wasn't just about him, or the other woman, or the embarrassment they'd feel. It was about reclaiming myself, my voice, my space, my presence. For years I had dimmed, hidden, adjusted, and now I burned bright, undeniable, untouchable. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, the sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors, warming the house that now felt like mine in every sense. I brewed coffee and stood by the window, letting the quiet settle. There was no rush, no panic, only clarity. The storm had passed, and what remained was power, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to be undermined again. He appeared at the kitchen doorway, hesitant, fumbling, trying to strike a conversation I wasn't interested in. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice low, like he was treading on fragile glass. I didn't answer immediately. I poured my coffee, swirling the liquid slowly, and let the silence grow heavy. I let him feel it. I let him realize that the comfort he had always assumed in our home, the quiet compliance, the safety net of my patience, was gone. Finally I spoke, calm, deliberate. "You made your choices. I'm making mine. And mine don't include the kind of betrayal that shakes the foundation of everything we've built." He tried to interrupt, but I raised a hand. "No, not this time. You need to live with what you've done. I will not rewrite my own story to protect your mistakes." It was then that I decided it was time for a final move, a public reckoning, subtle but undeniable. I invited a few close friends over, people I trusted, for a small dinner. I didn't mention what had happened, not directly, but I let my presence, my confidence, my quiet command speak louder than any words could. The room hummed with warmth, laughter, and attention drawn to me. The woman who had endured and emerged stronger, unbroken. He sat there, awkward, subdued, watching as everyone gravitated toward me, hanging on my every word, smiling at my stories, marveling at my composure. I let him feel the weight of their eyes on him, not with shame, but with subtle, undeniable reality. He had lost more than he knew. After everyone left, I stood in the empty dining room, letting the silence settle. My sister came up beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "You handled that beautifully," she said softly. I didn't need to reply. I could feel it in the air, in the echoes of their admiration and his discomfort. I had won, not with anger, not with revenge, but with grace, power, and an unshakable sense of self. That night, I lay in bed, the cool sheets against my skin, and for the first time in years, I slept without tension knotting my shoulders, without fear twisting my stomach. I had walked through betrayal, faced it, and emerged whole, strong, untouchable, and the world quietly had noticed. Days passed, and the tension didn't disappear. It transformed. It became a subtle respect, a quiet acknowledgement from everyone around us that something had shifted. My husband tried to speak, tried to regain control, but the truth was clear. He no longer held the power he thought he did. I did. Every glance, every conversation, every decision I made reinforced it. One evening, I attended a work event, the kind where everyone dresses sharp and expectations linger in the air like perfume. I walked in, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. My dress simple but elegant, my posture unshakable. People turned to look. Whispers followed. Not about gossip or scandal, but about the woman who had handled betrayal with a kind of quiet brilliance that was almost mesmerizing. I noticed him standing in a corner, trying to make himself small, invisible. He caught my eye for a fleeting second, and I smiled. Not cruelly, not vindictively, but with the calm satisfaction of someone who knows they've won without needing to fight. He couldn't say anything, he couldn't fix anything. The room, the energy, my presence, they made it clear. I was untouchable. Later, my sister nudged me gently. "You're glowing," she whispered. I laughed softly, a sound that carried ease and power. "It's not glowing," I said. "It's freedom." I realized then that the young woman had faded from the story entirely. Her role was brief, a spark in a much larger fire, and that fire was now mine to control. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need confrontation. I only needed presence, and presence was louder than any betrayal, any lie, any whispered secret. When I returned home that night, my husband was waiting, quiet, somber, defeated. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but I shook my head. "You already know what you've done," I said simply. "There's nothing more to say. We live our own lives from here. I am not your shadow anymore." And I meant it, every word. That night I went to the bedroom, slid into bed, and felt the weight of months lift from my shoulders. I let myself breathe deeply, let my body relax into the sheets, and I thought about how far I'd come. Betrayal had been a storm, but I had emerged the calm in its center. I was stronger, wiser, and more alive than I had been in years. For the first time, I wasn't defined by anyone else's choices. I was defined by mine. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting warm lines across the floor. I stood by the window with my coffee, listening to the quiet hum of life around me. The house felt lighter, freer, filled with the kind of peace that doesn't demand attention. It simply exists. He approached me slowly, careful, tentative, as if every step might shatter the fragile truce between us. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn. I let him stand there, the weight of his own actions pressing down. I know I can't undo what I did," he said finally, voice low, vulnerable. "But I want to try. I want to make things right." I turned to face him, calm, unwavering. "You can't fix what you broke, but you can live with it. That's your responsibility. My life, my peace, my joy, they're mine to protect. You lost the chance to have any control over that." He nodded slowly, acceptance finally settling into his posture. For the first time, I saw not the man who had betrayed me, but someone forced to confront his own choices. I felt no anger, no need for vengeance, only clarity, only power. Later that evening, I hosted a small dinner with friends. Laughter filled the room, the warmth of connection wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. People hung on my stories, celebrated my strength, and I realized something profound. The world wasn't diminished by betrayal. It only revealed who I truly was. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the journey, the shock, the heartbreak, the silent strategy, and the ultimate reclamation of myself. Betrayal had been the catalyst, but it didn't define me. What defined me was my ability to rise, to act with purpose, to reclaim my power in ways that left no doubt about who I was. I closed my eyes and smiled softly. I was whole. I was free. I was unstoppable. And the world, quietly, had witnessed my triumph. For the first time in years, I slept with no tension, no fear, no shadows lingering. Only peace, only strength, only me.